phenomenal. Why do you think our history, our legacy is always hidden somewhat, whether it's about Oxford, Cordoba, why is it always kept secret? And I already know, probably as being a scholar, when it comes to presenting documents, or probably when you had to get your doctorate and, talking about the Moors, that people were probably somewhat, scared about it, especially white professors, white doctors. So why, when it comes to our legacy and especially Moorish history, it's always kept hush hush?
That's a great question, brother. The reason, in my understanding after teaching now at the university and college level for some 3 decades,
Wow.
is that there is something that we can refer to as global Eurocentric hegemony, or so-called global white supremacy, right? In saying that, it doesn't mean that every person who's identified as or identifies with the term white is consciously, actively involved in trying to suppress African people in particular, or Asiatic people, from knowing who we are, right? But what I am saying is, this machine of perpetuation has been running for several centuries.
First off, Dr. Bey, thank you so much for coming onto the platform. I've been following you for a while now, and you provide so much information, valuable information. And I know that you've been doing this for decades at this point. So, I just want to give you your flowers and just say thank you starting off. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, brother. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, sir. Starting off, Dr. Bey, I think in one of your past videos that I was watching, it was so powerful talking about our Moorish legacy. Hearing those topics is always inspirational, for me, because we can hear a different perspective that doesn't start off in 1619 and, we aren't starting off in shackles, but, instead of knowing who we were and how powerful, that we were. And often, I would hear you say weapons of mass distractions. And I know right now during this time that we have cell phones and we have access to technology, but at the same time, we're just being dumbed down, not truly knowing who we are. So just starting off our Moorish legacy, who were we prior to 1619, where everything starts off with slavery?
Okay. Well, let me just say the context for why I even focused on, say, the Moorish legacy is because of exposure to an organization known as the Moorish Science Temple of America, which has different sects. There are different bodies, right? I'm not here to try to compel people, right, to become a part of that organization. That's their own free will choice. But I just want to give the context, right? So essentially growing up and being interested in our history because of my uncle, who was very adamant about knowing something beyond, Brother Caleb, what you just said earlier. Who were we before we were enslaved? Who were we before we were victimized? The tendency was always to put it in the context of our history was slavery and civil rights. When I say that, I'm saying in terms of our educational system, right? A lot of people didn't know about John Henry Clark. A lot of people didn't know about Dr. Ivan Van Sertima.
Right.
A lot of people didn't know, about various earlier scholars, including, if one went to college or university, they would have been informed of like Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, historian and sociologist, of course, and Carter G. Woodson, Lorraine Hansberry. But the point is, this was one of those blind spots in our history, largely because the educational system was not sharing this. So for me, when my uncle mentioned the Moorish legacy, right, and the Moorish Science Temple, because that was his context, having been a part of that organization since the 1950s, and then one that I would become a part of, in the 1980s. I said, well, the Moors And the only context for the Moors I had was in an advanced English class that I had in high school. We were exposed to Shakespeare's Othello. Then there was also a reference to the Prince of Morocco in The Merchant of Venice. So here you have, in terms of our, if you want to say our traditional or quote unquote classic education, you had some references to the Moors there, but that was it. Other than that, mostly the Moorish legacy was, as one elder used to say, buried in obscurity. So when we say Moors, we're talking about a distinctly African people, or you could say Afro-Asiatic people,
Right.
because the history of the Moors overlaps what we know as the continent of Africa, as well as Asia. And then when you're looking at the dispersal or the traveling of these Afro-Asiatic people throughout the globe, coming to the Americas as well in the pre-Columbian period, that would essentially be, one definition. So an Afro-Asiatic people. Later, with the rise of the religion of al-Islam, by the 7th century and the 8th century of the Common Era, or AD, then there's a period where Islam is associated with peoples coming out of the Arabian Peninsula and then moving west across the continent of Africa, engaging the Amazigh, also known as the Berber, and those people then beginning to embrace this religion that will become known as Islam. That then leads to them moving up into Spain and moving into areas of France and Italy and Sicily and Crete, and controlling for a while those territories. So most people understand the history of the Moors in the context of the Islamic era, and by Islamic meaning during the time of the Arab prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, and all prophets. So you have that aspect, right? Now, in fairness, I don't blame people as much for not understanding the history of the Moors, because as I just said earlier, so much has been buried in obscurity, number one. And two, brother, a great deal of effort has been made to deliberately hide it and obscure it, even as it started to come to the surface. So as a graduate student at Temple University, working with the late, great Dr. C.T. Cato and Dr. Malefi Asante, but especially with Dr. Cato, who was my primary advisor, also trained as a historian, and coming there already with a master's in history that focused specifically on Moorish Spain, that looked at the influence of what we know as Moorish control, meaning the Afro-Asiatic Islamic domination of the Iberian Peninsula, and the influence of those African and Asian or Asiatic people, if you will, on Europe, and Europe's ascension during what will become known as the scientific Renaissance in the 12th and 13th centuries, which is the same period that the spread of mathematics, algebra, alchemy or chemistry, advances in optics, advances in various areas of medical science. People like Averroes, whose name in Arabic was Ibn Rushdi's last name, Avicenna or Ibn Sina, Albucasis, various people who would also influence folks like Roger Bacon and Michael Scottus and Peter Abelard. I'm putting these names out because I know that as people follow up and study these individuals in European scientific history, what they need to know is that these European scholars were being educated in various aspects of the sciences by this Afro-Asiatic Muslim presence.
Wow.
So that, I know you probably have other questions, but
Oh
Just
yeah.
trying to summarize as best I can in the shortest amount of time possible.
You're fine. Look, I'm sitting back listening. I completely understand. Growing up, Robin Hood was like one of my personal favorite movies ever.
Yeah.
And I remember, history, that's my favorite subject. But in class, I would get so frustrated because I would see Morgan Freeman, Kevin Costner. And I'm like, Morgan Freeman, they found him in Jerusalem, Asiatic man, but nobody's like diving deeper. And then Jamie Foxx recently, that movie, I love Robin Hood, the basically like a sequel, modern version of it, but
Right.
that was excellent. But again, no one was like diving deeper. Me and my friends, like we went out and saw it, but like the whole time I was so mad. I'm like, y'all, he's a Moor. Nobody's talking about this. He's showing them
Yes.
technology, all of those things. And I think, oftentimes, whether it's a show like Vikings, Robin Hood, they talk about us, but then they don't dive deeper into explaining who we were.
Exactly.
So how do we find ourselves in film? Because sometimes we can see ourselves, but then at the same time, we can like overlook those factors too.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up those two films, because those two films were also catalysts for me in terms of using that even in my earliest teaching. Because when that came out, when I say that, meaning the first one, the Kevin Costner version with Morgan Freeman as Azim the Moor, right? I think that was 1990, or certainly early, if it wasn't 90, 91. And the fact that this film, where they took the Robin Hood legend and the writers decided to put into the film this fictional character of Azim, who for the most part is not in the original Robin Hood mythology, right? Now, ironically, there are references in British mythology that refer to Moors, both men and women. So that exists if one studies, like I said, British myth with connections to people like Robin Hood and even King Arthur, for example, right? The Arthurian myths. So that film, and then the more recent film, as you said, with Jamie Foxx, it's like people sat and watched it, but because I've shown that in my own classes.
Wow.
Most of my students said, "Oh, we saw the trailer," but they had no context for it. So they just thought it was some fantasy that had no basis in history, right?
Right.
And there was the opportunity being missed to actually say, well, wait a minute. They've got a character of a Moor in the medieval period of some 1,000 years ago. What's the context for that, right? Is there a hit? What is this with an African man? I think a lot of people, because they already have a very clouded and limited view of our history, may have assumed, since they saw this period piece, looked at it and said, "Oh, Robin Hood must have had a black slave, and that's the end of it." And it looks exciting, but I'm not particularly interested in watching something about medieval England. That's the impression. And even when I've spoken to some of my students about it, that's precisely what they thought.
Wow.
They had no context for it. So it doesn't, it's like seeds blowing over the desert. If the soil isn't fertile enough for the seeds to take root, it just keeps blowing and rolling on until it reaches fertile soil. Wow. Then I had a couple of students who actually said, "You know what? I saw that and I was curious because I had heard something about the Moors, for example."
Yeah.
And then said, "I wonder if there's a connection." And then sure enough, that was the case.
Wow.
Yep.
That's amazing. That's amazing. 711 AD, General Tariq. Again, growing up, bits and pieces. At my school, we had all white teachers, Asiatic students, but all white teachers. And there was one book in the stack, and it was about General Tariq. And at the time, I had no idea what I was reading, who I was reading about. But then from there, that sparked my interest in history, all that good stuff. And I'll probably say that might have been like in the 3rd grade. But Black History Month, none of these things are taught. So 711, who was General Tariq?
General Tariq was an African who comes in from West Africa, from the area now that we would know as the territory. That would be both Morocco and extending further south into what is Mauritania.
Mhm.
And Tariq ends up being one of the lieutenants in this early Islamic invasion that will be initiated by the surviving Umayyad dynasty, because there was a conflict between Islamic powers in the east around Damascus. And then you have this invasion where Tariq and then Abul al-Rahman I, who ultimately follow up and come into the territory that Tariq, and of course, the Rock of Gibraltar is named after Tariq, who invades in, like you said, in 711. Most of his army was composed of Amazigh or Africans. There will be Arabs, of course, who come into the territory because the Arab world, the Arab Muslim population from Saudi is moving west as well, having taken control of areas in Egypt and just continue to move further west. So Tariq is recognized as the person responsible for the successful invasion by African and Asiatic or African Asiatic Muslim forces into the Iberian Peninsula, which will then be secured ultimately by an independent Umayyad dynasty headed up by Abd al-Rahman I, whose mother was also African, was a Amazigh or Berber, quote unquote, Berber woman.
Wow, it's interesting stuff. In school, again, school is a crazy place sometimes when it comes to teaching, indoctrination, but dark ages in Europe, we'll be taught about that. But then all of a sudden there's this renaissance that magically happens and they start getting into the musical arts, literature, science, all those good things. So how did the Moors basically bring Europe out of those quote unquote dark ages and brought basically, civilization to them overall?
There was a principle in the early teachings of al-Islam of to really understand, if one was trying to understand God or understand Allah, one needed to understand the creation. I often talk about the idea of reverse engineering. You can only know but so much about the creator in terms of certainly traditional Islamic view and many other religious views, because we are to some extent finite, right? And there's actually a Moorish saying in terms of Moorish science: no finite mind can comprehend things infinite.
Wow.
But you can understand more, no pun intended, by actually dedicating yourself to understanding the creation. So the Moorish attitude in terms of access to God or Allah or knowledge was study the world around you. The more you study the world around you, the more you'll understand your creator, right? So this is very different than what the vast majority of Christian schools of thought at the time, which would primarily have been Roman Catholic, certainly in the Iberian Peninsula. And there wasn't a whole lot of scientific learning taking place. There are a few remote places. Medievalists have found some monasteries that had some ancient Greek and Roman texts that they used, but for the most part, this was not encouraged by the church, by the Roman Catholic Church. So just the value, the attitude that the Moors, this Muslim population had, emphasized the study of the world around them, and also took all the wisdom that had been accumulated over the course of antiquity, knowledge from Egypt, knowledge from Persia, knowledge from Greece, knowledge from Rome, knowledge from India, knowledge from China, because as the religion of Islam is spreading across the globe, Muslims are coming into contact with all of these other marketplaces of ideas. And because this was not suppressed as it had been at the time by the Roman Catholic Church, the Muslim world embraced it, encouraged its teachings. You had people like Ibn Hazm and others who were known, as great scholars of the medieval period. I already mentioned Ibn Rushdi or Averroes, who become renowned for teaching mathematics and medical science and history and aspects even of engineering, advances in agriculture, right? Introducing new agricultural products that didn't exist and introducing it on a wider scale, right? One of the things that's particularly significant is, of course, the introduction on a large scale of cotton,
Wow.
for the production, of course, of textiles and clothing. Most Europeans would have dressed in wool. Only the elites would have had access to like silks that were imported from the East and cotton attire as well. The Moors then set up schools at places like Cordoba and places like Toledo and places like Salamanca. And these schools, and of course in Granada, these schools become open to all. That's why when I mentioned earlier, people like Michael Scottus or Herman the German or Herman Alimanis and Roger Bacon, right? These are scholars that either went directly to Al-Andalus to study, which is what the Moors called, Moorish Spain, or what we know as Spain today in the Iberian Peninsula, or they began purchasing books because the Moorish Islamic world started to produce books in all of these areas that I just mentioned, all these different disciplines, scientific disciplines. And as they introduce this book market, people are then able to purchase the books and take them with them wherever they live. Wow. And the Moorish attitude, one of the things you may remember, perhaps from another lecture where I used the term the al-kitab, or the people of the book, where the Muslim attitude was Jews, Christians, and Muslims were all people of the book, meaning the Old Testament. And while the Muslims disagreed with the Jews in terms of aspects of theology and the rejection, of course, of the latest prophet being Muhammad, right? Peace be upon him and all the prophets. And the same attitude, say, towards the Christian community of saying, we love and revere Jesus, or in Arabic, Isa. In fact, he has a whole chapter, a whole surah dedicated to him and his beloved mother. There were differences over theological interpretation, but the Muslims at that time expressed a level of tolerance that is still noteworthy. I'm not talking about perfection, right? Because some people then will say, it's a bunch of romanticism. No, it's not a bunch of romanticizing about tolerance. The Muslim world, compared to what was happening in most Roman Catholic circles at the time, were exceedingly tolerant, even respectful. Titus Burckhardt's book, which was written, almost 30 years ago, right? But still stands as one of these classic works that address this level of tolerance, because it's simply called the Moorish culture, right? This idea of being tolerant was a characteristic that even Christian rulers or Christians living in the community appreciated. And there's what's known, in fact, in Spanish, the convivencia, this idea of people being able to live together in a kind of respect and tolerance that allows the society to move forward collectively in many areas because of that cooperation. I'll say again, it doesn't mean at every point in time and in every place that's there. You can't, no historian could say that and know that that's a blanket statement that holds up. But compared to what was happening, like I said previously, this level of tolerance, and there's a book that I'm actually in the process of reading now that carries the title. It's called The Ornament of the World. It's the name of the book. But the ornament of the world was what a nun, Haratzvither of Gandersheim, writing in the 9th and 10th century, talking about her stories. I think it was, forgive me if I may, I think it was in the 10th century, writing about the stories she's hearing about how far advanced the Moors were, right? The Afro-Asiatic or the African, Muslim community or the Asiatic community, whatever terms one chooses to use, right, was with regard to Europe. And so these schools are set up. These book sellers are now, a major force. Cordoba in the 11th century has something like 10,000 people who are registered as book dealers.
Wow.
Right? So that's telling you, right? And of course, when I say registered, meaning for tax purposes, municipalities always, set up a bureaucracy to figure out things around revenue and profession, et cetera. So that, or I should say, those things are what start to pull the majority of Europeans, certainly in Western Europe, out of what is known as the Dark Ages. So, and then I'll add one of the things so I don't forget. There's a documentary called When the Moors Ruled in Europe by a medievalist, a British lady, Bettany Hughes, historian, Cambridge University graduate. And she points out at the end of that documentary how Oxford University gets essentially its primary foundation in terms of really beginning to advance the sciences after someone named Daniel Morley has traveled to Moorish Spain, acquired this tremendous library, brings these books back to what is now Oxford, and that begins to propel European universities beyond simply being what are called cathedral schools.
Wow.
Right? Because cathedral schools, their primary focus was really just on teaching you how to be a good priest and how to serve the Roman Catholic Church. Going beyond that means they're now studying the sciences, even when the sciences contradict what the theology was at the time. Things like the world was round. Moors knew the world was round, right? Just as the ancient Greeks knew the world was round. Just as the ancient Egyptians knew the world was round, right? So the point is, but information will be suppressed at certain points in time by certain authorities so that they could hold power. And in short, the Moors opened the gates of knowledge to a larger group of people, both in, of course, in the African and Middle Eastern world, if you will, as well as in Europe.
Wow. That's phenomenal. Why do you think our history, our legacy is always hidden some way, whether it's about Oxford, Cordoba? Why is it always kept secret? And I already know, probably as being a scholar, when it comes to presenting documents, or probably when you had to get your doctorate and, talking about the Moors, that people were probably somewhat, scared about it, especially white professors, white doctors. So why, when it comes to our legacy and especially Moorish history, it's always kept hush hush?
It's a great question, brother. The reason, in my understanding after teaching now at the university and college level for some 3 decades,
wow,
is that there is something that we can refer to as global Eurocentric hegemony, or so-called global white supremacy, right? In saying that, it doesn't mean that every person who's identified as or identifies with the term white is consciously, actively involved in trying to suppress African people in particular, or Asiatic people, from knowing who we are, right? But what I am saying is this machine of perpetuation has been running for several centuries. It even speaks to why, for example, 500 years ago or 600 years ago, if one used the term Moor, there was no doubt that that term was referencing primarily people of African descent. But what you find over the course of centuries is that some people say, well, wait a minute, no, that term also was seen to reference people who were known to be Arabs, even people from India. Yes, but my point is, when you go back at the beginning, when the term Moor is being utilized, right, in the context of European history, in the context of dictionary definitions, that's one of the greatest sources anyone can use to understand what the perspectives were of people at a given point in time. Go to dictionaries from the 17th century. Go to dictionaries from the 16th century. See how the Dutch, see how the English, see how the Spanish, see how the people of Italy, although there was no Italy as we know it today, because it was various states, but go to the earliest sources to see how they defined folks. And it was clear that people who were Moors, who they referred to as Moors, were most assuredly either African or clearly dark complexioned non-Europeans connected to Asia, right? That's why I mentioned India, for example.
Right.
But the reason for hiding the information, think about this. Almost 800 years, African and quote unquote Middle Eastern people occupied the Iberian Peninsula. They didn't just influence the culture in terms of the sciences and worldview. They literally influenced the culture in terms of bloodlines. The infusion of African and Middle Eastern blood into the European populaces or populations in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, in Crete, and to some degree, I mean lesser, although there's a historian named Onyeka who recently wrote a book on the Tudors, the Black Tudors in England. And he talks about these African people that were coming into Britain, both from the period of the Romans right on up to the Tudor era. And Onyeka spends most of his time talking about the Tudors, which was one of the dynasties of the British crown, the British royal families or family. So the idea of telling the truth, putting something right out front, means that it's going to challenge the whole notion of ethnic identity or racial purity, as well as challenging the narrative of global white supremacy. Because what you're actually doing is saying, wait a minute, Western culture, the best of what's Western culture, is still an aggregate of taking the knowledge of people from Asia, Africa, and incorporating that into the European world. And then I dare say even incorporating the knowledge of the peoples of the Americas as well, right? Global white supremacy cannot allow for that, because what it's trying to do is sustain the misrepresentation of itself as inherently superior at all points in time.
Wow.
Once you start to uncover Europe's own history, with its debt to the Moors, in this case, since this is our topic, right? What you're doing is saying, you all know, number one, that you got much, if not most of your seed money, so to speak, for this investment in intellectual and spiritual growth from non-European people. Just tell the truth. See, my thing is this, I'm not taking anything away from European advances, right? People advance, cultures advance, knowledge all the time. But at least acknowledge who taught you, who gave you the foundations to then advance and move forward. Because then what you have is a greater recognition of the cumulative efforts of the human family, right? The analogy that I use often, and even reference it in my book, Othello's Children in the New World, you know, in a baton race, right? You got 4 people on that track. If the last person running that baton across the track says, look at what I did all by myself, how are the other 3 baton runners going to feel, knowing that them running their leg of the track was completely ignored? And so much of what our educational system, when I say our, meaning within the Western world in general, but in particular in the United States, much of what that history has represented is an effort to ignore the other 3 runners on that track, right? And as a result, discussing the history of the Moors begins to cause an unraveling of the myth of inherent European supremacy, or so-called white, quote unquote, supremacy.
Wow, that was excellent. Cordoba, Spain, beautiful place, very advanced. The Moors, they were doing amazing things. How sophisticated was Cordoba during this time under the Moors?
You had a sewage system, you had hot and cold running water, you had libraries, public libraries, you had floors, second floors to homes among what you would consider the more middle class people. You had one of the largest populations, something like 500,000 people in one city.
Wow.
By the 11th century, which was larger than any other city in Western Europe at the time. You had a society that, again, encouraged academics. So whether it was going to the universities called madrasas, or whether it was people part of what you would call literary salons, like people would meet together and discuss the latest works.
Wow.
Reading these books. And again, we're talking about 1,000 years ago. They had a mail system, you know, to transport mail that was akin to what we would see later in the United States with the Pony Express. Just major advances, and you know, public baths, because the Muslim world, right, and the Moors put a premium on cleanliness, something that many within the church would represent at the time. And that made for a much more attractive environment, to say the least.
Yeah.
I mean, those are some examples. And again, when I mentioned the nun who was in Saxony, you know, outside of Moorish Spain, who heard these stories. I mentioned, you know, Haratzvita of Gandersheim, who talked about Cordoba as the world's ornament, right? Heard these stories. And the environment would then inspire other cities or other rulers in other places to try to match that level of beauty. You know, the huge mosque in Cordoba, architectural wonder, you know, the more efficient use of the water wheel, advances in metallurgy that would be known in places like Cordoba, but mostly in Toledo, because people talk about Toledo steel. And the formula for Toledo steel is said to have come from Damascus, and it probably did, but it was then being produced in Moorish-controlled Spain.
Wow, that's great. We hear of words such as alcohol, alchemy, algebra, all of these things. And growing up, we had no idea that this had anything to do with the Moors at all.
That's right.
What impact did they have when it comes to alchemy, when it comes to chemistry, when it comes to alcohol, cleanliness, knowing about germs, bathing, all those things?
Right, right. Ibn Khatib had talked about unseen contagions that would get on the vessels and the clothing of people who had been infected with the plague. And they basically were identifying what we know as germs. The Moors also produced nitro and muriatic and sulfuric acid. They had, for the purposes of industry, they used, in working with metals and other things. As you said earlier, the term alcohol, which comes from the Arabic alcohol, and it's basically, a means of a disinfectant, an antiseptic. And these antiseptics would then reduce infection. The fact that other words like, pancreas and aorta and rice, aruz, are all telling us about the breadth of the influence, right? The agricultural influence in terms of food, the influence in textiles, like I mentioned before with cotton or cotton. Even in music, the guitar is going to be influenced also by the Muslim, the Moorish musicians that are in in country. It's vast. And what again is so interesting is over the last 20 years, when I've watched as more and more, if you want to say mainstream Western historians or scholars started to look at the history of the Moors when, 30 years ago, when I did my dissertation, almost 30 years ago, it wasn't quite that long, but certainly when I was in grad school, there weren't a whole lot of scholars addressing the history of the Moors. Ivan van Sertima was one of them when he decided to do his book, The Golden Age of the Moor. And that, was early 90s, 91, 92. So we're talking about an exponential interest in this by European American scholars or European scholars. And unfortunately, it appears most of them have tried to still diminish or de-Africanize that Moorish presence. Not all of them, but or certainly to try to leave it so, as I said earlier, obfuscated that African people, the so-called Black people, are not able to understand this is you. These are your ancestors, right? Yes, there were Europeans there because it's in Europe, but understand that you're talking about an African presence, an Asiatic presence that results in advancing the culture ahead of all the other cultures at the time, for the most certainly within Europe, in terms of the areas of science and advancing what we know now as higher education. So there has been an increased interest, but at the same time, it appears there's been an increased desire among many to try to negate or devalue the distinctly African presence that involves this, what I have called for some time now, this Moorish legacy.
Wow. Previous lectures, which I've checked out, awesome work, talking about Pope Innocent III, which I find very ironic for his name, but slaughtering thousands of people. Why did the Roman Catholic Church, and still till this day, view Islam and the Moors as such a major threat during their time?
Well, it's a religion, meaning Islam, is a religion that comes on the scene and challenges the autonomy that the Roman Catholic Church had held, almost as a monopoly, right? To be clear, the Orthodox churches of the East, so we talk about the Greek Orthodox Church or the Serbian Orthodox Church or the Russian Orthodox Church or any of the Orthodox churches of the East, because understand that even in the history of Roman Catholicism, and when the Roman Catholic Church will consolidate as a church several centuries into this common era, or AD, or however you want to put it, Anno Domini, the church controls places like Constantinople and Rome, and then ultimately there's a schism, there's a break, and that schism results in the Roman Catholic Church now being at odds with the Eastern Orthodox churches, plural. And there'll actually be, you mentioned, Pope Innocent III and his involvement, well, I'm assuming you're referring to his involvement in the slaughter of the Cathars.
Right, yes, sir.
Right, the Cathars, or the Albigensians, which were a Christian sect that were essentially pacifist and just left alone, but they were seen as a threat because the very idea that they were interpreting Jesus the Christ differently than the way that the patriarchs of the Roman Catholic Church were interpreting it was seen as a threat. And that would be true of any Christian community, whether they were Gnostics, whether they were adoptionists, whether they were Ebionites, or any of the other sects of Christians. Even the Church of Arius, which had actually been in the Iberian Peninsula, was seen as an enemy of the Roman Catholic Church, right? Because their theology differed from what the church was promoting. So you can only imagine when a new quote unquote religion like Islam comes in and says, you need to look at a unique or different interpretation of Jesus and a different interpretation of God Almighty, right? Because that's essentially what the Muslim world was saying, right? That puts more emphasis upon Jesus as a prophet and not Jesus as the only begotten Son of God. That's a challenge to their authority. So because the Islamic world's narrative on Jesus differed from the one that the European powers of the Roman Catholic Church in particular held, that was understood to be a threat. Now, what's so funny is there were Roman Catholic bishops or archbishops who didn't seem threatened by the Muslim presence and were more inclined to work with the Muslim world, because the Muslim world, the Moors, like I said, were very tolerant. And they're like, look, we're not going to force you to convert to Islam. You're a Christian, you stay a Christian. As long as you're not swinging a broadsword at me, we're good, right? Yes. So you do have that level of tolerance. And there were even people like Raimundo or Raymond, one of the bishops in Spain, who became known for his what's called adoptionism. The adoptionist view of Christ, which wasn't created by him. This goes back centuries earlier, as the early Christian faith was trying to figure out how to interpret the nature of the Christ. In fact, it's a whole area of theology that's known as Christology, right? What's the nature of the Christ? Was Jesus the Christ God? Was Jesus the Christ a man? Was Jesus the Christ a man who became God? Was Jesus the Christ man God, right? I mean, these were the debates that people were having in the early centuries, the early decades of what becomes the religion of Christianity.
Wow.
And because you had Muslims who are showing up and saying to the Christians, hey, we also love and respect Jesus.
Mm.
For those Christians who were critical thinkers and perhaps less dogmatic, feeling less threatened by the authorities of the Roman Catholic Church, they were the ones that started to go over and convert. So you do have large numbers of conversions by Christians starting in the 8th and 9th centuries. And then by the 10th century, you have people complaining about it in, Catholic circles, saying we're losing basically good Christians to these infidels who are convincing them that their understanding of God is more accurate than ours. And then you have a whole tradition of martyrs, and a group also known as the Mozarabs, which were basically Christians who adopted much of Islamic Moorish culture, but they kept their Christian faith. But they started to wear silks, they started to bathe, because bathing was generally understood to be a sure sign you were probably a Muslim, because Christians did not customarily bathe or clean themselves, certainly not as frequently or in the ritual sense that Islam required of its adherents. Anyway.
That's awesome. Again, I heard you say before as well, Cordoba, I think their literacy rate of the population was somewhere around 75%, but then throughout Europe, basically 1%, which was probably the Catholic Church and priests and, them probably speaking Latin and not sharing that knowledge. Why do you think knowledge was so important for the Moors and then for Europeans not as important and only for the top 1%, which is what we kind of see right now as well today?
It was important for the Moors because at the time, again, the early interpretation of Islam was that the better you study and understand the world around you, the closer you are to Allah, right? You want to get close to Allah, study Allah's creation.
Wow.
That was the intellectual view, essentially, right? So that's very unique for the time, because in the context, certainly of the Roman Catholic Church, you were a good Christian if you simply went to Mass regularly, did your confession, were baptized, confirmed, essentially, all the requirements, the 7 requirements, essentially. And it didn't require you to really focus yourself on studying the world. Wow. Your salvation was essentially in the hands of the church. The religion of Islam said, your salvation is in your hands. Are you praying? Are you praying, 5 times a day? Are you, and although it's not required to read the Quran al-Sharif, are you able to read the Quran al-Sharif? Are you also asking questions of the imams? Are you doing things to try to understand Allah and yourself and the world around you, right? That type of empowerment was essentially unique, certainly at the time, because you had the Muslim world encouraging this. Now, there are historians who talk about the influences of some of the mystery schools that existed, both from, again, Egypt, as well as in Greece and Rome, that were also in the mix, right? Certainly even the Gnostics, I mentioned the Gnostics earlier, the Gnostics being a Christian mystical group that basically believed Jesus brought special knowledge, gnosis, that humanity should study in order to make ourselves like the Christ. So the idea was you don't simply find your salvation in his crucifixion. You find your salvation in living as he prescribed you to live.
Mhm.
He gave you a path, the way. He gave you a playbook, so to speak, that you should utilize. That was the Gnostic understanding. And there are different schools of Gnostics. So some people, say, well, there are certain things that the more problematic, but there were other things that I would say were not. It was basically, how do you live a loving and good life? How do you do good in the world, right? That type of thing. Healing other people means you need to learn medical science. You need to learn pharmacology. Being able to assist in creating a better society means you need to know something about building and therefore carpentry skills, etc. And you want to advance in those things. You could even say knowing things like metallurgy to produce better tools so you can make a better society, right? The understanding, certainly among the Moors, was you want to give people as much knowledge as possible because we are creations of God or the Most High, or you could take it another even further and say, we are the vice regents or the representatives of God Almighty or Allah on earth. And we're supposed to manifest the best of what Allah is. Those attributes that we know Allah to be, we should manifest the best of that in this world so as to make the world a better place.
Wow.
This kind of intersection of certainly things that relate to Christianity, but also things that relate to what one might consider, traditional al-Islam or Islam. Those are factors that are at work during this time. And people in the church, like a lot of places, don't want to give up power. And the idea of sharing that knowledge openly meant we cannot as easily control these people if they are able to think critically and for themselves and do for themselves. We have to convince them that their salvation is in our hands. So if you do wrong, I'm going to make sure you go to hell or to purgatory. Whereas the Muslim world is saying, you don't have that power. What will get me to the afterlife, whatever that is, are my own good deeds, my own actions. I mean, and I could go on and on about, for example, the significance of Martin Luther and his challenge to the Roman Catholic Church, because it relates to this in terms of what becomes the Protestant Reformation. But I also say one other thing before I stop here, let you ask another question.
Of course.
I do believe that the Moors, the Muslim presence, does result in influencing what becomes known as the Protestant Reformation. That's a chapter that's often either avoided, if written at all, in most Western histories, say, of religion and theology. And that's a shame, because what we're talking about is, again, what I said earlier, the idea of the collective contributing to the advancing of society or of humanity for the greater good of humanity, right? And so, in short, the reason why the church was threatened is because the church understood it would be losing power to a foreign religion, as well as losing power over its own adherents.
Wow, that's powerful. One of my last few questions, I would see pictures of white men wearing fezzes, calling themselves Shriners, things like that, or, read about Thomas Jefferson having a Quran under his desk. What impact did the Moors have on Freemasonry, secret societies, politics, all the elite people that we know of now and today?
The Rosicrucian order, let me just start with that. the Knights of the Rosy Cross, explicitly says in its own history that Christian Rosenkreuz, who was a German, traveled to Fez to study with the Moors there. And this would have been 16th century. So here's the Rosicrucian order, which is part of these, like you say, secret or really semi-secret societies. As far as Masonry, what is kind of hidden in plain view goes back to what you just pointed out. Why would top-level Masons begin wearing fezzes or the tarbush, which is a head covering that comes from Africans and Asiatics, right? And is associated with wisdom, certain level of wisdom that's attained. When you look at groups like the Shriners, the ancient Egyptian order of the Mystic Shrine, the ancient Arabic order of the Mystic Shrine, that Europeans would adopt in the context of the United States, certainly by the late 19th century, they are mimicking the ancient wisdom of Nile Valley civilization, depending upon the particular order, India, and then also the wisdom that would be acquired and spread during the period of the Moors, right, in terms of the post-Islamic period, if you will. Because like I think I was trying to make the point that you can speak of the Moors in the context of a period before the 7th and 8th century AD, right? But this influence in Freemasonry, which is there, the fact that, and I made this discovery while in graduate school, that even the name Mason, right? The name Mason, the surname, one of the coats of arms for the surname Mason is 3 Moors' heads conjoined on one neck. So there's even a reference to that in the very name Mason as a surname.
Wow.
As far as you mentioned the political aspect, the United States as a nation is founded with the help of the Moorish Empire. The first country, and some people try to debate this, but then I'll see diplomatic historians who will say, here's the evidence. When you have Sidi Muhammad reaching out to George Washington and saying, we are willing to send you a camel corps to help you in your struggle for independence. But Morocco, or the Moorish Empire, establishes a treaty with the United States, when it is the United States, in 1786, 1787. But the earliest references to diplomatic engagement go back to the beginning, to 1776, 1775. So there is clearly a link to the Moorish Empire. Presidents of the United States, a large number of presidents, were Masons. Depending upon how far up they go in the Masonic order, you would come to understand that there is a Moorish connection, certainly an Egyptian connection, but also a Moorish connection to the Freemasonic tradition. Again, in their histories, their constitutions, they talk about this. It's not secret. People like Martin Bernal and Black Athena, who I knew, we had some of these conversations when I was a graduate student, and had even hoped before he made his transition that we could have worked together, collaborated on something. But he talked about this, the European interest in Freemasonry and how Freemasonry has connections clearly to African people, including the Moors, and of course with roots in Nile Valley civilization. So all this stuff is there. Why would people now this is not directly related, say, to the Moors in terms of what we're discussing now, but it's something related to Africa. Why have the symbol, an African symbol, an obelisk, put on the graves of European American presidents who were supposed to be, or assumed to be, Christians? An obelisk is an African or Kemetic symbol. Why build the Washington Monument, which is a gigantic obelisk, right? Well, because Washington was a Mason. Yeah, but why that symbol? All of this is telling us about these aspects of Africa's history, the history of African people in the United States and earlier in the colonial period as well. So, I mean, there's so much, brother, there that I could talk about, but I know we're almost out of time today. So maybe another 5 minutes.
Of course. Yes, sir. Very last question, twofold. Why is it so important, for us to know who we were as Moors and still are? And then part two, we're taught about Christopher Columbus, 1492, History Channel. They had a whole docuseries. I think it was a History of Mankind, I think. And I used to love History Channel. But then at the same time, you start to see that correlation. Okay, he, quote unquote, discovered America in 1492, where he came over, crossed the seas, the ocean. But then at the same time, we fell in Grenada at the time in 1492. Exactly. So what connection is there between that and how Christopher Columbus was able to find the Americas, and then how do we fall?
I document most of this in my book, Othello's Children in the New World. But in short, Columbus in 1492 gets the monies primarily because Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile and Aragon, or Aragon and Castile, ended up having the financial means to then fund Columbus's expedition. Right. Columbus, as far as I'm concerned, did know where he was going. He had also on his ship translators who spoke Urdu and Arabic and Hebrew. If you are going to, I'm sorry, not Urdu, sorry, Arabic and Hebrew. If he was going to India, he should have had someone who spoke Urdu and Hindi. So we have someone who also on his ship were Moriscos, Moors who had converted to Christianity, who were cartographers, major assistants in navigation to even get to what we call the quote unquote new world. And when he gets to the quote unquote new world, to areas like the Bahamas and Cuba, in his diary, he talks about people who looked like Moors on the shores of what is Oriente in Cuba, right? It's the eastern shore of Cuba. Even the fact that the country is called Cuba, to me, was always interesting, because Cuba is also the name of a place of refuge in Maghreb Arabic.
Wow.
So, and when I say Cuba, people say Cuba, but the proper pronunciation would be Cuba. And Cuba is a place of refuge for the marabouts or the Murids, who were those people, those African Muslims who were basically taking refuge during these conflicts, both with other Muslim powers and non-Muslim powers, including, of course, Christians, Catholics, as there was a battle to then get control of the coast of Africa, so as to then initiate what we'll know later as the asiento, or the enslavement trade, right? The quote unquote enslavement trade, or the asiento. So all of that is part of this. And the fact that so many of us, Brother Caleb, are distracted by nonsense, spending inordinate amount of time on social media, talking about and doing nothing meaningful, rather than saying, just like you did, wait a minute, why is it that the ancient Egyptians and Kemites said, know thyself? Why was that so important at the temples in Luxor and other places? Why would the Greeks and then the Romans adopt the same thing and understood there's value in this, but African people, so-called Black folks, don't, right? The short answer is because we've been under psychological warfare for quite a while. Part of that warfare got us to disassociate ourselves from our actual names, who we actually are. Chinese don't call themselves yellows.
Facts. Yeah.
Indians don't call themselves browns. Indonesians don't call themselves browns and yellows, right? Japanese, I mean, I go on and on. And if you say, well, we don't know who we are, we know we're Africans. You may not know what specific nation or ethnic group or quote unquote tribe you come from, but you know that much. Why are you disassociating yourself from what would be a great starting point? And in fact, for me, when I look at the legacy of Drew Ali, who I do believe was a prophet, he was trying to get us, he gave us a clue. He said, you're Moors, we're Moors. Now go and find out how that is. And that's why I wrote the book that I wrote, because I said, the average person hearing us talking about identifying as Moors, then I don't know what you're talking about. What is it? Because we don't understand, as you, with your last question pointed out, we don't understand the historical connections to these lands and the historical connections to the founding of this democratic republic, this constitutional democratic republic that is the United States of America. Direct involvement of African people, the Moorish Empire, in helping to get it off the ground, helping to establish it. Now one can talk about, yeah, and look at what happened. Yeah, look at what happened. You had unscrupulous Europeans did things to undermine. I'm not here to debate that because there's no debate there. That's a fact. But it's also true that there are Europeans who did not try to undermine, who said, with the help of the Moors, we've created something great and we want to make this work, right? Out of many, one. But what's also required is that we as African people, or Moors or Asiatics, need to know thyself so we're better prepared to do something to improve this constitutional democratic republic. Wow. It's a sacred obligation. That was even pointed out in the Chicago Defender, which is a newspaper, so-called Black newspaper, that wrote about the movement, the Moorish Science Temple movement in the mid 1920s, and said that Drew Ali was teaching people to fulfill their sacred obligation as citizens. What do you mean sacred obligation? Sacred means divine. There's some kind of spiritual significance to this, right? But that requires that you live a certain way. Love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice, in that order. How can you go wrong if you follow those tenets? People tell me they don't believe in God or whatever. And I'm thinking, look, do you believe in ethics? Do you believe in being an ethical or decent person? Okay. Well, if that's the case, what is to dislike? What last point, I promise.
No, you're good.
Okay. What is to dislike about the teachings of Jesus the Christ? When I've had students tell me, I mean, literally, this may sound crazy, they hate religion. And then they go more, so I say, well, which religion? What do you mean religion? Christianity. And I'm saying, all right, well, I understand, I think what you're suggesting, because you're saying that a lot of hypocrites. Yeah. I said, but what about the teachings of the Christ? And what about the teachings in the Christ in the context of Islam? Huh? Because you can also find out what Jesus, or Isa in Arabic, was teaching. When you study that, there's nothing to if you have any sort of ethical root, there's nothing there to hate. How could I hate somebody saying, love thy neighbor as thyself?
Mm.
How can I hate somebody that says, be in service to others, do good in the world, right? The problem, here's the problem, is that a lot of us, if we have some semblance of consciousness, will say, well, Jesus is shown as a Caucasian man. And I'll tell them, now we're talking. Now you're talking about it, something that I agree with you on. That's part of the psychological warfare. That Christianity in the Western world has largely presented itself as an expression of European global supremacy by putting a European man up as an ancient Asiatic Hebrew. That doesn't make any sense, right? So, know thyself. Everything I just said, brother man, is intended to get us to see the importance of studying ourselves. Study yourself. Study your individual self, right? Meaning you, the individual, brother Caleb, me, the individual, brother Jose or Dr. Bey, and then yourself as in, who are you representing by virtue of your being here? People look at us, they say, well, obviously you are part of this community or that community. Are you doing anything to elevate the value of that community? Study thyself, know thyself, right? Higher self or lower self. When you study yourself, you know what your lower self is and you get it in check. When you study yourself, you study your higher self and you let that rule the day, right? Your higher self, right? Justice, mercy, love, and right should always serve first. That should subdue your lower self, which is essentially that, hatred, slander, lust, murder, theft, and everything that harms. That's in the context of Moorish science, but basically that applies across the board. Your lower self is that self which isn't concerned about the well-being of others and is not trying to do anything good in the world. That's the lower self. Higher self says, I can do better. But when you don't know who you are, you're an amnesiac. Somebody else puts another program in your brain. You're black, and then they tell you black is associated with evil, black is associated with death, etc. And that's the overwhelming representation. And now you're fighting and struggling against that in a society to try to make black a positive. Many of us have been able to do that. Kudos. But the point is, it's a trap. It was set up to make it more difficult to see value in being black because the society has essentially reiterated linguistically. In fact, the term is neurolinguistically, in fact, has reiterated over and over the negativity of it. And then if we don't, and then the other thing is the trap doors. When I was doing research and I would go to these medieval history texts, if you go and you look in the index, right, reading a history of Moorish Spain or medieval Spain, and you go to the index and you see in the index, blacks and Negroes. So then you go to that section of the book, the blacks and the Negroes are referenced in this book on medieval Spain as the slaves who were brought in. You get the point? It didn't occur to someone unless they knew the history that the whole book is essentially talking about you.
Wow.
But by creating these words, I think Asa Hilliard, the late great Asa Hilliard, used to talk about name calling, right? Asa Hilliard was an educational psychologist. Name calling. European world created a name, gave it a certain meaning, a certain energy, a certain vibration. And then unbeknownst to us, because we didn't know or we don't know ourselves, we latch onto it and take on its characteristics. I'll say it again. It's the reason why Asians do not identify themselves as yellow Americans or yellows. Anyway, I'm gonna stop.
Wow. Dr. Bey, thank you so much. You've been beyond gracious with your time, sharing so much information. I just want to say again, on behalf of my entire age group, we thank you so much. Thank you for all the work that you're doing and that you've done. So I just want to say thank you. That's a wrap, but that was a phenomenal conversation. I appreciate you.
Well, let me just say to you quickly, Caleb, brother, please keep up the good work. I'm so impressed and I'm honored by you.
Thank you.
See you as a young man who sees the importance of history and knowing thyself and doing what you can to get to your peers, your generation. I mean, I commend you, and I of course wish you well and empowerment and all the best, brother.
Thank you, Elder. I most definitely stay in touch. I'm going to save this recording too, just to make sure that we got it.
Yes, sir.
So I'm about to save this and we are good to go. But thank you so much again.
You're welcome, brother. I say peace.
All right. Peace.
Say peace.